Hello. Hi, Uriel. We are doing the New Deal with FDR, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I want to take a look at the assignment and the test questions and be sure that we are on the same page with everything, okay? Do you have any questions? Any questions or comments before I begin? All right, sounds great. All right, I'm glad to have you. All right, and so let's see here. I'm going to share the page. I'm going to start with this PowerPoint, okay? So firstly, right, remember that we're in the midst of the Great Depression in 1932, and there was a big pendulum uh, 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 switch, swing, in that the Democrats, their candidate is going to be very overwhelmingly elected against the Republicans who had carried the day in the 1920s in the executive branch. And that's going to be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was like a fifth cousin to Teddy Roosevelt. All right. And so with him, he was famous for his New Deal, with which brought about recovery and reform. And anyway, let's jump right into the first 100 days. All right. So he declared a bank holiday right off the bat. He shut down the banks, and this had happened in over 20 states. But it was a big confidence builder in the establishment, the institutions of the banks, because the bank sentiment was very low popularly. There was a lot of frustration toward the banks when people were unable to get their deposits, when they came in such large numbers to extract their deposits, and some were unable to, as many banks folded, right? Thousands of banks folded. And so he came in, and he, in sort of Darwinian fashion, he decided which banks ought to die, and which banks, had a lot of connections by way of a lot of loans and investments, and needed to stay afloat. And he is going to bail them out by fiat spending, by just simply printing more money. All right. And when they reopened 4 or 5 days later, it was like March 6th through March 10th, where he closed them down, all those connected to the Federal Reserve. When they were brought back open, they had a simple sticker on their windows, contending that they were backed by the federal government in the Federal Reserve System. And he engaged in fireside chats. And Franklin Roosevelt was known for his charisma, and to the point in which his critics called him a demagogue, a manipulator of the common people. But at any rate, with his charisma, and he would just tell them, simple facts like, I'm very sorry if you were unable to feed your children today, but I want you to know that I did this, and this week. I plan to do that, and that next week, and I'm going to get Congress to address this, and this, and we're going to get this and this on a developmental path. And so with the fireside chats, they were very effective, supposedly. For one, right, when with the bank holiday, he told Americans and tried to assuage their fear, and told them that they need to put their money back into the bank, that the bank money does not just sit in a deposit, but it goes out to other loans and other investments that are necessary for the entire economy. And much of his rhetoric was very patriotic and really revolved around cooperation and civic virtue, doing your part for the entire country. So at any rate, that's exactly what he called Americans to do. And it didn't take long, and $1 billion was deposited into the banks. And so he really helped rescue the banking system. And then he engaged in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And remember, he did it, but he got Congress in an emergency session in his first 100 days to authorize him to do these things. So with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, what he wanted to do is he wanted to realign production with demand, because that was a common problem during the Great Depression, is you had all these products being produced and no demand for them, no actual ability to pay for them, to consume them. So at any rate, he wanted to bring down production to the point of killing cows and livestock, pouring out gallons of milk, having people extract their peach trees and cut down their production in certain commodities. He even paid them to do so. So he would get the leading growers in the different industries together, and they would collaborate with the government and decide how much acreage of what crop or what commodity needed to be produced. And he subsidized, he paid people to do this. So some people were being paid not to farm, to set back the acreage or the amount of their agricultural product that was being produced. And some people were paid to switch crops, etc., to realign production with consumption, with demand. And in doing so, right, that was constitutionally dubious. You know, with our capitalist system, the government cooperating with growers and deciding and telling people how much to grow, how much to sell, what to sell, right? And subsidizing them to do this. So it initially was struck down by the conservative Supreme Court, and he got it passed around via another name and good nomenclature by his lawyers, his teams of lawyers, where they renamed it like the Soil Conservation Act. But you're going to see this time and time again, his administrative policies being struck down by the Supreme Court. The Civilian Conservation Corps, it employed 250,000 young men. They put them in army barracks, and it sent them to the state and national parks and other not agrarian, but forest ridden areas, and had them engage in public works, forestry work. And so they were awakened at the bugle of a call. They had like a police force to watch law and order amongst them, right? Because he said you can't have someone get up in 1 a.m. and blow a bugle. And so it looked a lot like the black shirts of Italy under Mussolini and the brown shirts of Nazi Germany, having these young men in these Army Corps organizations engaging in public works. So it smacked of something very far to the right, just as the Agricultural Adjustment Act smacked of the collectivization of agriculture campaign of the Soviet Union, of communist Russia. And so at any rate, it alarmed a lot of people, but it put 250,000 young boys to work. And, you know, that's at the heart of what he did is, well, I'll get to that when I do the WPA. And then the beginnings of the Glass-Steagall Act, they implemented a policing function over the stock market, where brokers and other middlemen had to give full, accurate information to their investors as far as what they were doing in gambling with their money in the stock market. And so it established, at first it was under the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and then they established the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that served as the policeman over the stock market. And that was very popular because there was a lot of public ire against, you know, the stockbrokers from the big fall in October of 29 of the stock market. Then he engaged in what flirted with gas and water socialism by way of the Tennessee Valley Authority, whereby the government engaged in hydroelectric production and provided it not through a middleman, not through a private electric company, no PG&E, et cetera, like usual, but directly afforded it to the Southern people. And it even subsidized, in some cases, that electrical power. So they saw how much you could pay, and they foot the rest of the bill if you couldn't pay the regular market price for your electricity. And so remember, with gas and water socialism, that was the far left of the progressive movement, where you decide, things like access to water, electricity, medical care, education, public transportation, go beyond mere, goes outside the realm of meritocracy, of what you merit, what you earn, what you deserve, what you're able to afford or not able to afford, but that go within a realm of entitlement, whereby the average person is entitled to it as like a natural right. So I call it gas and water socialism or diet socialism. And so the government flirted with that with the Tennessee Valley Authority. So you see how kind of radical a lot of these changes are. The government is heavily getting involved in the economy, in the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. The National Industrial Recovery Act brought forth over 70 codes in a myriad of industries. The industries just technically had to entail interstate commerce under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So the federal government could have a constitutional foot in it and be able to regulate it. And but nevertheless, it was still struck down by the Supreme Court. But what they tried to do is similar to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is they tried to regulate how much of each product was being produced. They even set price ceilings and set prices, which went against the spirit and the law of the Sherman and Clayton antitrust acts. And they also had a famous Section 7A, which would culminate in the Wagner Act, spelled like Wagner. And the Wagner Act instituted a minimum wage law for workers. So now with these codes, it's saying, the proper way to not take shortcuts and not do dangerous things with the production of their product for their workers or their consumers, how they're going to produce, how much they're going to produce, how much they're going to charge for their product, and how much they're going to pay their workers, and how many hours they're allowed to work their workers per week. This is heavy intervention in the economy. And it was struck down as well, initially by the Supreme Court. Then the Works Progress Administration at any given time directly employed 2.5 million people. So they're not using private construction companies as middlemen anymore. The federal government is directly employing, directly putting to work and paying millions of Americans to engage in public works and other things. And the WPA went really out of its way to employ people from a myriad of backgrounds and with a myriad of skills. They had a federal theater project, a federal writers project. They had historians who were paid to go down into the South and interview African Americans as primary sources who had been born into slavery still at this time in the 1930s. And so, it went out of its way to try to employ as many Americans as possible. And this happened to go in line with the writings of a guy named John Maynard Keynes, Keynes. And so they call it Keynesian or Keynesian economics. And it's popular in academia. And that's why FDR is popular in academia, because let's face it, academia does lean a little to the left. And as far as being a bit liberal, neoliberal, not old school liberal. Old school liberal is like libertarian, government stay out of our autonomous actions. Neoliberal is for a bigger welfare state, a bigger, larger government intervention in the economy, especially on behalf of the marginalized, of the workers, of those at the bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum. So at any rate, they had uniforms to put on, they were paid, I think weekly. With the CCC, for a while, they were only allowed to keep the young men a third of their salary, and 2/3 of their salary had to go back to their families so their families could have purchasing power. And again, that goes in line with John Maynard Keynes' philosophy of economics, is that the litmus test for a healthy economy, in his estimation, was to ensure the purchasing power of the average American. All right. And Franklin Roosevelt, his policies ended up being kind of in line with the writings of Keynes. And so this is Keynesian economics, whereby the government is engaging in deficit spending, spending money that it doesn't have, getting itself further indebted, but to directly prime the pump, to empower average Americans to be able to spend, to be able to go to the market and buy things. All right. And so that's kind of the spirit of the New Deal. The Social Security Act was arguably taken from further left. You look at a guy named Robert Townsend. You look at a guy named Huey Long. They were further to the left than FDR, arguably. But he saw how popular this was on their platform, and he took it and he ran with it. And the Act of Right, paying for age-old security, so that when you retire, you receive stipends, right? And it also is the beginning of later on Lyndon B. Johnson's, some of his administration's policies, is they're also going to provide immediate relief to unmarried pregnant women, the disabled, etc. And so who may or may not have paid into it. And how are they going to afford this? Well, by the time he ran in 1936, he said, we need to tax the rich. We need to tax inheritance taxes up at a certain high point. We need to tax with a highly graduated rate. The more you make, the higher rate that you are to be taxed. And also we need to engage in high corporation taxes. And so he, by his 1936 campaign, he was making himself an enemy of the very class to which he belonged, the wealthy. Because the irony here is, right, is that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, having a palatial place at Hyde Park, New York, where the rich resided. And so, yeah, and so then you have the Fraser-Limke Act, and that afforded farmers 5 years, and then after that, just 3 years extension, and in a possibility to reacquire and gain a second mortgage to their home before their farms were foreclosed. And in some areas, the rate went as high as 40% of farmers were able to reacquire their farm because of this act. But it too was shot down by the Supreme Court. So then in 36, with his campaign rhetoric, he really fired it up. In 32, you could make the argument that, according to H.W. Brands and other historians, he made it clear that he wanted more of a planned economy. And remember, a planned economy was part of what the Soviet Union had, an economy that was just that, that was had some planning by the federal government and involvement by the federal government. So he certainly was not laissez-faire at any time in his rhetoric. Before he became president, when he was the governor of New York, he had something called TERA. I don't remember what it stood for, but TERA. And it afforded work relief and other types of relief for the unemployed in New York during the Depression. And so he certainly was not a laissez-faire guy. He likened himself, even more so than a Democrat as he was, as a progressive. And remember, we've gone over the progressive movement, try to rectify and mitigate what they perceived to be problems, inequities, and injustices of the Industrial Revolution, right? And so by way of largely through more government intervention in the economy. But by 36, his anti-wealthy, his anti-rich, his anti-corporation rhetoric really arguably heated up. And he really began making enemies amongst the wealthy. And he even tried to pack the court. He had a famous instance in which he spoke to Congress and told them that there were a few Supreme Court justices who ought to retire. And if they do not, they're unable to, he said, handle the workload. And so he advocated putting as many as 4 more Supreme Court justices onto the Supreme Court, which would have brought it to 13. And of course, with those 4, he would have chosen arguably yes men as far as alignment with his New Deal. And it didn't work. It didn't happen. But his critics are going to claim that he was a demagogue at this time, trying to manipulate the system, manipulate everything for his own enrichment, his own power, to get his New Deal going without opposition. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and I want to get into the main interpretations of the New Deal. All right, that I've come across. So for one is court history, him being an idealistic, radical ideologue, someone who has a grand vision for moving our country to the left, having much bigger government involvement in the economy, and being a Keynesian man, right? Being a man for deficit spending to ensure the common man's purchasing power, right? You could see this not only through some of the policies that we've already gone over, but also through his informal cabinet. He had Ray Moley, Rex Tugwell, a guy named Adolf Burl, Felix Frankfurter, and these other gentlemen who were in their intellectual writings pretty radical for their time period. And the argument is he knew that the Senate and the country, perhaps, and the Republican Party could not stomach such radicals in his cabinet officially. So he didn't choose them as his official cabinet members. He chose them as assistants to his cabinet members. And what he would do is he would make the official cabinet members, and the official cabinet members were much more palatable, people that were more centrist, a lot less radical, and hence, the people could and conservatives could more easily accept them, like a guy named Morgenthau. Oh gosh, the other guy's name is Wallace, Henry Wallace. He would team them up with guys like Ray Moley and Rex Tugwell, and he would make them come to an agreement together, knowing full well that they were pretty far from one another on the political spectrum, and that they were going to dispute and argue and disagree over a lot of fundamental things. And he would have them to dinner, and he would see them debate, and the primary sources indicate that he would just laugh and say, guys, you're going to have to come up with some type of consensus, or one of you is going to have to convince me of the correctness of his cause, of his idea, over the other by the time this gets through Congress. And that's another thing. It's kind of like the bully pulpit of Teddy Roosevelt. He would make Congress meet together, and in the guise of the State of the Union address, he would tell them almost precisely what needed to be done and what he expected them to do and what his plans were. And he expected Congress to, consent to it. And he got a lot of consent by virtue of the very fact that we were in such a miserable depression, and there was such a sense of emergency. He likened the Great Depression to a state of war, that we were in a state of war against poverty, unemployment, overproduction and underconsumption, and that he needed their immediate help. And he threatened that if Congress didn't do what he called for them to do, He would go by way of his fireside chats, by way of his 2-day-a-week press conferences. He would go above Congress's head straight to the people and tell them that their congressmen were not doing their job. So he was a heavy-handed president, and he got a lot done, good or bad. And he was elected 4 times, the only president to have been so. And so you could see how, a lot of people either loved him or hated him as a president, this Franklin Roosevelt. So at any rate, yeah, so you see here, he says in a famous speech in Traitor to His Class by H.W. Brands, no more reliance upon the laissez-faire rhetoric and approach, that there's no secret invisible hand or magician to rectify the problems of the Great Depression, but direct government intervention and cooperation is necessary to ensure decency and ensure economic security for the American people. Okay. And by the way, the informal cabinet of radicals were known as the USS Roosevelt Men, because they had traveled on the USS Roosevelt, named after his fifth cousin, Teddy, and traveled to Europe and wrote and studied and wrote about the fascist and communist countries of Europe and how they were combating the Depression. And yes, they were praising some of their policies, contending that some of the, and by the way, they weren't fascist. They weren't, as far as I know, with Tugwell and Moley, etc. They weren't communist either. But they contended that you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that there were some good ideas by the fascist and communist countries. And so that's important to remember as far as, them being a bit radical. Then you have William Leuchtenberg's book, and he says, I think Franklin Roosevelt was just a pragmatist. I think he was a typical politician. I think when you look in 32 and he was running for office, he didn't know what direction to go in. Yes, he talked about government planning. Yes, he talked about government intervention in places like Topeka, Kansas, and Atlanta, Georgia. But he didn't say anything about a lot of the major things he was going to do. He didn't say much about direct, employment of the American people by way of work relief programs. He didn't say anything about deficit spending and taking us off the gold standard and just spending fiat new money to try to fund these programs. A lot of the fundamentals of his New Deal were not espoused in 1932. Leuchtenberg says, instead of just hiding those things because the public would think that's too radical as he ran for president and that he wanted to hide it, Leuchtenberg thought it's evidence that he didn't know yet what he wanted to do. And then as for his informal cabinet, he respected their intellectual prowess, not necessarily that they were far to the left or far to the right, but that simply he thought they were very smart and well educated, and he wanted to try out different things. And when you look at his Wednesday and Friday press conferences, he oftentimes would have as many questions to the press as they had for him. And he would kind of lay an idea out for something that was in the mix and say, what do you think the American public would think about, mass employment programs, of public works, et cetera, et cetera. And he would try to gauge what American public sentiment, where it was on that given topic. And if he felt like it would be interpreted as too radical, he would back off, at least for a while, and take his time on that particular project. And so was he just a typical politician who was almost improvising as he was president, trying to get the smartest men he could find to come up with basic solutions? Because when you think about it, right, he wasn't uniformly to the left nor to the right. The government getting involved and with prices and production techniques and payment of their workers through the National Industrial Recovery Act. Right-wing governments under Bismarck and other governments were doing that, not just left. And then, of course, things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, telling farmers what to farm, how much to farm, et cetera. That did seem to be a lot like the collectivization of agriculture program of the Soviet Union. So that seemed to be far to the left. But both the left and the right engaged in mass employment relief programs and public work programs for the people. And so, Leuchtenberg says this guy was all over the place. He didn't know where he stood. He was just improvising. And, he has a quote, Franklin Roosevelt saying, for God's sake, try something. And so perhaps that's what he was just doing when he was president. And a third interpretation is that he was a demagogue. And remember the demos, or the people in Greek. And so a demagogue is someone who pretends to be one of the people, really gets down to their level and relates to them well. But a lot of it is a mirage. He's an elitist, really. And he has his own designs and his own power in mind. Because you look at the New Deal, right? He kind of bullied Congress into forming all these, these acronym related programs that were run by which department? The executive department, his own department. So he really enriched his own power. He enriched his own department's power. And so some people, he ran for election 4 times. So some people think that he was a demagogue. And then fourthly, historians like Howard Zinn think that secretly he was conservative, because yes, he implemented some radical means, some radical methods, but his goal, right, arguably, was to save capitalism and not become a fascist country, not become a communist country. And really, in the end, that's what he did do, is he propped up, through the worst depression we've ever had, he saved the capitalist system. He bailed out the banks. He cooperated with big businesses. He cooperated with big farmers to help rectify their problems. So in the end, perhaps his goal was conservative. And that would also go in line with the fact that he was a wealthy man himself, and didn't want truly any type of radical redistribution of wealth or anything like that could adversely affect himself and his own family. So that's also something to think about. And also the fact that those who were on the very far left and far right, like Huey Long on the left from Louisiana, and Father Coughlin very far to the right with his radio show, he was greatly opposed to them, and he didn't try to hide it. He thought they were too radical to the left and to the right, respectively. All right. So you have those. Now let's take a look at the questions. Let's see here. So, Court History of Franklin Roosevelt and of the New Deal praises his evolution into a benevolent, paternalistic ruler via experiences with polio and his relationship with his wife, Eleanor. You will find that on section number 2. Number 1 or number 2? I have to go back to the argumentative assignment itself. But in one of the first 2 sections, you will find just that. And that is part of court history. You look at his experience at Warm Springs, Georgia, and you see almost an epiphany that he experiences with young kids who were afflicted with polio as he was. And he really grew accustomed to suffering, especially being a man who had lived a life of ease, economically at least, throughout his young age and wealth. Polio really struck him harshly. His ego, his ability to operate daily. He went through depression, etc. But at Warm Springs, he saw that some kids could not afford to go past a free summer's camp, and he was so moved that he bought the place and provided it for free for the kids. And after that, you see, like in his fireside chats on the radio and so forth, you see a tone of a lot of compassion. And some court historians contend that that happened because of his contraction of polio, his experience with suffering, his experience with the suffering kids of the country with polio, and his interaction with them, and also with his wife Eleanor. According to the narrative, romantically, they had a very strange marriage, didn't live together very much, but they had a great friendship, and she was able supposedly to elicit depth out of him. When they were dating, she brought him to a settlement house to see the poor immigrants there, and it supposedly moved him. She was a progressive through and through. She helped out the marginalized. She was probably the most, at least up to that date, the most active, politically active first wife of the president that the president had, constantly going on political tours and speaking and meeting with people, especially the marginalized, the left out. She took a stand for African Americans. She took a stand for women. She took a stand for children, etc. There's a book called Letters to Eleanor, and it's very moving as far as what people would write to Eleanor Roosevelt and ask her for a cow, for food, for a baby sister. It's really moving. So at any rate, that is true. The following New Deal programs were depicted by the instructor as arguably radical. So which option doesn't fit? So one of them I twist around. So notice C, the Agricultural Adjustment Act inaugurated a system of federal subsidization and coordination of farming. Absolutely. Look above it, B, the WPA established a massive federal works program with no private middleman, construction companies, and deficit spending to give purchasing power to the average Americans. Yes. But TVA, I mixed it up, didn't I? Remember, TVA flirted with gas and water socialism and providing hydroelectric power subsidized to the poor Southern people. Number 3, William Leuchtenberg. Remember, he saw him as a typical politician, a pragmatist. Number 4, A is correct. H.W. Brands. Franklin Roosevelt was consistently and philosophically against laissez-faire principles. B, Franklin Roosevelt's placement of his somewhat radical and formal cabinet arguably demonstrated a willingness to tamper with novel ideas. Yes. C, Franklin Roosevelt arguably broadened the scope of executive leadership and involvement in the economy. Absolutely. D, Roosevelt's call to industrial cooperation in spite of American political tradition and antitrust laws under the slogan of patriotism in a time of virtual war was quite controversial. Yes. And then E, Roosevelt challenged traditional notions of meritocracy via his national dole system. No, he didn't go that far. He felt like Americans needed to work for their money. He didn't want to give out the dole to just give out, unemployment checks and stimulus packages, etc. He didn't go that far. All right. 5, Franklin Roosevelt could be portrayed as at least moderately conservative in that he salvaged the capitalist system and opposed far left and right-wing politicians and movements. Yes. All right. So Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal from 32 throughout the 30s. I say that because by 41, we're in the war, and that took precedent over combating the Great Depression, arguably in his policies and his time, etc. But it, like I said, it's largely in line with the writings of John Maynard Keynes, deficit spending to provide purchasing power to the average American. It involved cooperation between the federal government and the leading industries, both industrial and agricultural, to try to help out the imbalance of supply and demand, right? And also, like with the Wagner Act, some basic rights for the unions and for the laborers, as far as a minimum wage, maximum work hours, and policies on how their working conditions were to exist. So he did a lot. The government really enlarged itself in scope, the executive department in particular, and much more direct government responsibility for the economic well-being of Americans that you find in the New Deal, right? Because he's going to contend that as long as people are willing to work, they have a right to benefit from the system. They have a right to have a job. They have a right to earn a salary. They have a right to accrue the fruits of this system. So that's all.